Picture this. You're scrolling through Pinterest planning your dream wedding, fairy lights, mason jars, and a hashtag that perfectly captures your love story. Now, imagine if I told you that just 800 years ago, your wedding night would have been witnessed by a crowd of strangers cheering from the sidelines, or that your marriage might have started with you being literally kidnapped from your family's doorstep. Welcome to medieval Europe, where "till death do us part" took on a whole different meaning. I'm about to take you through 5 wedding traditions from the Middle Ages that will make you grateful you were born in the 21st century. These aren't fairy tale romances or Disney princess stories. These are real historical practices documented in church records, legal manuscripts, and royal chronicles that survived centuries to shock us today. From rituals that violated every concept of privacy we hold dear, to ceremonies that would land someone in prison today, medieval marriages were less about love and more about survival, politics, and proving your worth as human property. By the time we're done here, you'll never look at a wedding the same way again. So grab something strong to drink, because we're re-diving deep into the dark side of I do, when saying no was unreally an option. Trust me, after hearing about the bedding ceremony, you'll be sending thank you cards to whoever invented the concept of a private honeymoon. Let's start with a tradition so invasive, so publicly humiliating, that it makes reality TV look like a masterclass in discretion. Tradition 1. Bedding ceremony. The bedding ceremony wasn't just a tradition, it was a public spectacle that would make modern reality TV producers blush. Picture this. You've just said your vows in front of God and your families, and now comes the part that medieval society considered absolutely essential. The entire wedding party, including your parents, siblings, and random nobles, would literally escort you and your new spouse to your bedroom. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. They didn't just drop you off and wish you luck. According to historical records from the 12th to 16th centuries, witnesses would actually stay in the room to ensure the marriage was properly consummated. The Catholic Church required physical proof that a marriage had been completed, and privacy was considered a luxury that newlyweds simply couldn't afford. In royal marriages, this practice was even more extreme, with court officials taking detailed notes about the proceedings for legal documentation. The marriage of King Louis VII of France and Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1137 was witnessed by dozens of nobles, who later testified about the consummation in court records that still exist today. But it wasn't just about legal requirements. Medieval society believed that without witnesses, the devil could interfere with the marriage bed and curse the union. Priests would often bless the bed beforehand, sprinkling holy water on the sheets, while the couple waited awkwardly nearby. The psychological trauma this caused, especially to young brides who were often teenagers, is documented in personal letters and diaries that survived the centuries. Some brides would literally faint from the stress and humiliation, which was considered normal and even expected behavior. The practice was so ingrained in medieval culture that refusing witnesses was grounds for annulling the marriage entirely. Even worse, if the bride showed any signs of reluctance or fear, it was interpreted as evidence of witchcraft or demonic possession. This wasn't romance, this was a business transaction with a very public quality control inspection. Tradition 2. Marriage by capture. Marriage by capture wasn't a metaphor or a romantic gesture. It was literally kidnapping someone and calling it a wedding proposal. Across medieval Europe, from the Scottish Highlands to the Germanic tribes, stealing a bride was not only legal but considered a legitimate way to secure a marriage. The practice was so common that many languages still carry traces of it today, like the English phrase carrying the bride over the threshold, which originated from literally carrying off a kidnapped woman. In medieval Scotland, clan raids specifically targeted young women from rival families, and successful abductions were celebrated as both military victories and marriage ceremonies. The rape of the Sabine women wasn't just ancient Roman history. It was a blueprint that medieval societies followed for centuries. Legal documents from 12th century England show that courts regularly ruled in favor of men who had captured their wives, as long as the woman eventually consented to the marriage. But here is the twisted part. Consent was often considered valid, even if it came after months of captivity and psychological manipulation. The Germanic law code, called the Salic law, explicitly stated that a man could claim any woman as his wife if he could successfully abduct her and keep her for 3 days without her family rescuing her. In Ireland, the practice was so institutionalized that there were professional bride stealers, called abductors, who would kidnap women for wealthy men who could unwin them through normal courtship. The Catholic Church initially condemned the practice, but by the 13th century, they had created legal loopholes that essentially legitimized rape and kidnapping as long as it ended in marriage. Medieval chronicles describe elaborate bride-stealing expeditions that involved dozens of armed men, detailed planning, and sometimes resulted in full-scale wars between families. The most disturbing aspect was that once a woman was captured, her own family would often pressure her to accept the marriage, rather than face the social shame of being damaged goods. Even when the practice evolved into symbolic rituals, the underlying message remained the same. Women were property to be taken, not partners to be chosen. This wasn't love conquering all. This was conquest disguised as romance, and it shaped medieval attitudes toward marriage and consent for generations. Tradition 3. Child marriage and betrothal. Child marriage in medieval times wasn't an exception, it was the rule, and the ages involved would horrify any modern parent. Girls as young as 7 years old were legally betrothed, and marriages were commonly consummated when they reached 12, which was considered the canonical age of consent by the Catholic Church. But here's what makes it even more disturbing. These weren't just arrangements between families. They were calculated political and economic strategies that treated children like chess pieces. The marriage of Isabella of Valois to Richard II of England in 1396 is a perfect example. She was 6 years old when she became Queen of England, and the marriage was designed to secure a peace treaty between France and England. Medieval records show that noble families would betroth their daughters before they could even walk, sometimes arranging marriages while the girls were still in the womb. The practice was so systematic that there were professional marriage brokers who specialized in pairing children from different kingdoms to maximize political advantage. What's truly heartbreaking is reading the personal accounts of these child brides, many of whom wrote letters describing their terror and confusion about their adult responsibilities, and gave birth to her only child at 13, a traumatic experience that nearly killed her and left her unable to have more children. Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, was married at 6, widowed at 7, remarried at 9. The physical consequences were devastating, with medieval medical texts documenting the high mortality rates among young mothers and the permanent health damage caused by early pregnancies. But the psychological trauma was equally severe, with many child brides developing what we would now recognize as severe depression and anxiety disorders. The economic aspect was particularly cruel, as families would literally sell their daughters to the highest bidder, with dowries negotiated like livestock prices. Even more disturbing, if a child bride died before the marriage was consummated, her younger sister would automatically take her place in the arrangement, treating children as interchangeable commodities. The Catholic Church, despite setting the minimum age at 12, regularly granted dispensations for even younger marriages when political alliances were at stake. This wasn't about love or even compatibility. It was about treating children as investment portfolios and diplomatic tools in a world where human rights simply didn't exist. Tradition 4. Trial by ordeal for loyalty. Trial by ordeal for marital fidelity turned suspicion into a death sentence, and wives were the primary victims of this medieval justice system. And if her burns healed cleanly within 3 days, she was considered innocent. If a husband even suspected his wife of adultery, she could be forced to undergo brutal physical tests that were designed to prove her innocence through divine intervention. The most common was trial by hot iron, where the accused wife had to carry a red-hot iron bar for a specific distance, and if they floated they were guilty and would be executed, but if they sank and drowned they were posthumously declared innocent. But here's the twisted logic. If the burns became infected or didn't heal properly, it was proof that God had abandoned her because of her guilt. Medieval court records from across Europe document hundreds of cases where women died from these ordeals, while their husbands faced no consequences for making false accusations, and if she choked or showed any difficulty swallowing, it was considered proof of her guilt. The trial by cold water was equally barbaric, where suspected adulteresses were bound and thrown into rivers or ponds. In some regions, wives suspected of infidelity were forced to drink poison and survive to prove their innocence, a test that killed more innocent women than it ever did. The most psychologically cruel was the trial by consecrated bread, where the accused had to swallow a piece of blessed bread. What makes this even more horrifying is that these ordeals were often public spectacles, with entire communities gathering to watch women suffer and potentially die for unproven accusations. The Catholic Church officially sanctioned these practices until 1215, when Pope Innocent IV finally banned clerical participation, but local courts continued the practice for centuries afterward. Medieval legal texts reveal that men could initiate these trials based on nothing more than rumors, dreams, or personal paranoia, with no evidence required beyond their word as husbands, because it literally put a price tag on a woman's virginity and reduced her worth to a single night's performance. The gender bias was so extreme that husbands accused of adultery rarely faced ordeals, instead being allowed to prove their innocence through combat or by finding character witnesses. But the value of that gift depended entirely on his satisfaction with her virginity and sexual performance. Even more disturbing, if a woman survived an ordeal but was left permanently disabled or disfigured, she was often abandoned by her husband anyway, leaving her destitute and this wasn't justice, it was legalized torture disguised as divine judgment, and it reveals how medieval society viewed women as inherently untrustworthy and disposable. Tradition 5. Morgan Geb and property rights. The Morgan Gab, or morning gift, was perhaps the most dehumanizing tradition of all. This wasn't a romantic gesture or a token of love. It was a payment system that treated women's bodies like rental property with a damaged deposit. The morning after the wedding night, the husband was legally required to give his new wife a gift. Medieval legal documents from across Europe detail the specific amounts that were considered appropriate, with virgin brides receiving significantly more valuable gifts than those who were suspected of prior sexual experience. In Germanic law, the mortgage could include land, livestock, jewelry, or money, but the amount was directly tied to the husband's assessment of his wife's purity and compliance during their first sexual encounter. What makes this even more disturbing is that the gift wasn't just symbolic. It often represented the only property a woman would ever legally own in her entire life. If a husband was disappointed with his wife's virginity or her behavior on their wedding night, he could give her a token gift worth almost nothing, effectively declaring her worthless to the entire community, and creating a system where their worth as human beings was literally determined by their husband's satisfaction with their bodies. Court records from 13th century France show cases where husbands publicly humiliated their wives by giving them gifts of single coins or worthless trinkets, which served as a permanent mark of shame. The practice created a horrifying incentive system, where young women were taught that their entire future financial security depended on their performance, during what was often a traumatic and painful experience. Even worse, if a woman received a small mortgage jab, it affected her status for the rest of her life, influencing everything from her social standing to her children's inheritance rights. The tradition also gave husbands legal grounds to claim their wives had deceived them about their virginity, which could be used as justification for annulment, abandonment, or even violence. Medieval chronicles describe cases where women who received inadequate mourning gifts were essentially cast out by their own families, who saw the small gift as proof of their daughter's dishonor. The psychological impact was devastating, with many women developing severe anxiety and depression around their wedding nights, knowing that their entire future hung in the balance of one night's events. This wasn't about celebrating a new marriage. It was about commodifying women as sexuality. closing. So there you have it. 5 medieval wedding traditions that make modern Britisillers look like absolute saints. From public consummation ceremonies to legalized kidnapping, from child marriages to torture disguised as justice, medieval Europe turned what should be life's most joyful moment into a series of human rights violations. These weren't isolated incidents or rare exceptions. These were the standard operating procedures of an entire civilization that lasted for nearly 1,000 years. The next time someone complains about modern wedding planning stress, remind them that at least they don't have to worry about their entire extended family watching their honeymoon or their husband literally purchasing them like livestock. What's truly sobering is realizing how recently these practices existed in human history, and how many of the underlying attitudes about women, marriage, and consent continued to influence society for centuries afterward. The idea that women were property to be traded, that their worth was tied to their sexual purity, and that marriage was primarily a business transaction rather than a partnership of equals, didn't disappear overnight. In fact, many of these medieval concepts about marriage and gender roles persisted well into the 20th century, and some echoes can still be found in certain parts of the world today. But here is what gives me hope. The fact that these practices now horrify us shows how far we've come as a civilization, and that privacy and dignity are fundamental human rights. These concepts that we take for granted today were revolutionary ideas that took centuries to develop. But what you're not seeing, because the absence of these medieval horrors, is actually one of humanity's greatest achievements. The idea that marriage should be based on mutual consent, that women have the right to choose their partners. Every time you see a couple exchanging vows based on love rather than political alliance, every time a woman walks down the aisle by choice rather than force, every time newlyweds enjoy a private honeymoon, you're witnessing the triumph of human progress over medieval barbarism. So the next time you attend a wedding, take a moment to appreciate not just what you're seeing. Marriage has evolved from a system of oppression into an institution of partnership, and that transformation represents hope for continued progress in all areas of human rights.